Hi everyone. So we are going to start our American National Government class talking about citizens and government. And we are going to begin with looking at two students who are going to become involved in government at a very young age. On the left side of your screen, you are going to see Sarah Blair. She became involved in government at a young age. She is a freshman in college, and she is actually the youngest member of the West Virginia House of Delegates. And she became a member of that at the age of 18 years old in 2014. And the gentleman that you see here, this is Kendrick D. Johnson, and he is actually the youngest city council member in Texas, and he's a senior in college. Now, they both accredit to becoming members of their government at a young age to Obama whenever he is quoted as saying that you should grab a clipboard and get signatures and run for office yourself. They want people to be involved in government at a young age, and we sometimes assume that you have to be much older to become involved in government. That's not necessarily true, and I wanted to start off our lecture in our class pointing out that just because we are young in college, that it doesn't mean that you cannot be involved in government. And we need to talk about, what is government? How can we define government? And that's how we're going to start. Government refers to the institutions and procedures through which the land and its people are ruled. To govern is to rule. Government can be simple. We can see that it is a town meeting where they can talk about budgets and policies, or it can be very complex. And we can see it could govern large countries, extensive laws, procedures, bureaucracies. Think of the United States as a whole and the federal government. That is a very complex government compared to a very simple government, which would be your town's government and the policies that you may see within your town. Historically, we see a lot of different types of governments, and we're going to talk about different types of governments throughout history. The tricky thing about government is to make it stable. Government can be very explosive. And another tricky thing about it is to get it to promote liberty, equality, and democracy. And we'll talk more about all of that. So, two questions that are of specific importance in determining how a government differ are who governs and how much governmental control should be permitted. Thomas Jefferson, you guys should know who that is. He's our third president, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He has been quoted, he believed that the best type of government is a government that governed the least, one that didn't have a whole lot of control. And we are going to discuss the different types of government, and you guys can kind of see why he believed that the best type of government was one that governed the least. Our democracy is that type of government, and he was coming out of an authoritarian government style. This is a government where we have one formal body of government. You're going to have a king. Think the King of Britain. They are going to have really primary control. They're not going to really recognize formal limits, and they are really only going to be controlled by the restrictions that are put in place by the social institutions. Okay, so the example I gave was Great Britain. So King George III, whenever we came out of the sovereign, which was Great Britain, whenever we drafted the Declaration of Independence and gained our freedom. That was an authoritarian government. King George III had primary power. The social institution that we're talking about is Parliament. Parliament had some restrictions over the king, but King George III really had primary power and really didn't have a whole lot of restrictions on what he could do. The next form of government that I'm going to mention here is a totalitarian government. That's a mouthful. It's one of those tricky words to say. This one has no formal limitations and really has no restrictions on it. So think of Nazi Germany ruled by Adolf Hitler. Think about the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin's control. So we have one person completely in control. Nobody really has any way of limiting what they are capable of. And that brings us to democracy. This is a government that the citizens play an important role. The citizens roll themselves through election. We have a constitutional government, and that's the norm in a democracy. This is what we have, so this should sound very familiar to you guys. Formal and effective limits are placed on the government. Constitutional democracies were really unheard of before the modern era. This is a modern concept. The 17th century governments are going to start acknowledging two things, and that's going to be formal limits on their power, and they're going to start providing voices for ordinary people. So this is when we're going to see that shift come in from having those authoritarian governments and those totalitarian governments, and we're going to start seeing people have more control over their government. So now we're going to explore the limitations of governmental powers a little bit further. And there's really a key force behind these limits, and it's going to be a new social class of people, and these are the Burgesses. This is a French term for the freemen of the city or the middle class people. They're also associated with the involvement in commerce or industry. So think of middle class people working in industrial positions. This placed the limitations on, the sheer number of these individuals placed limitations on the aristocratic groups of people, and that placed limits on the powers of the government. So this group of Burgesses, they did not like the aristocratic, that rich ruling class, that hierarchy group of people who just stepped into a position of power because they were born into these positions. So this middle class group of people, they didn't like that. They made up the majority of the population, so they began to stand up for the fact that they didn't like these people just being born into these ruling positions. So they were able to assert their discontent, and that effectively put limitations on the government itself. Now, their motives were primarily selfish, but they were able to defend liberties that really helped most people, such as the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, the freedom of arbitrary search and seizure. And these different limitations and these different desires to protect these liberties really did help most people. It's important to note that this group of people, the Burgesses, they didn't favor democracy as we know it today. They were advocates of electoral and representative institutions, but they did favor property restrictions and other restrictions whenever it came to voting. So they didn't want just anybody to have a opinion whenever it came to voting. They didn't want everybody to have the ability to participate in the electoral process. They wanted to have their control. Once again, they were a selfish group wanting their own selfish means, but they were helping other people in the process of pushing forward their selfish motives. Before we start this slide, I want to talk about two terms that it's kind of taken for granted that everybody knows. Those terms are suffrage and disenfranchisement. Suffrage, it sounds bad. Keep that in mind, but it is good. It is the right to vote. So suffrage means the right to vote. Disenfranchisement means taking that right to vote away. Those are two terms that I often see students struggle to remember, or it's just kind of taken for granted that they already understand the definitions of. Another term that you're going to see used in your book quite often is the expansion of participation. This basically means that more and more people have a legal right to take part in politics. Those are just a couple little definitions there that I wanted to draw your attention to while we are looking over our slides. So politics here, what is it? Harold Laszlo, he's a famous politician, famous political scientist, and he's quoted in your book, and I like this quote, as saying politics basically means who gets what, when, and how. So the definition of politics, as your text describes it, is the conflict, the cooperation, negotiation, compromise, and choices over the leadership, structure, and policies of government. It also involves power of influence over a government's leadership, organization, and policies. So it's a little bit of a complicated definition. You're going to see this definition on the test. I can tell you that right now. So you might want to make a little note of that. Politics are shaped by the system of government in place. That's especially true for the democratic governments. If we were to be having this discussion in class, I would ask you guys and hopefully start a discussion on whether you believe we have a representative democracy, also known as a republic, or a direct democracy. This question is really kind of a trick question because we kind of have both. I should say kind of, we do. A representative democracy or a republic is what we have at the national level. It is a government in which people select representatives who play a major role in the governmental decision-making process. These are our members of Congress. We elect Congress members who will then vote on bills that may be passed and different laws that will be put into place. The direct democracy is a system that permits citizens to vote directly on laws and policies. The example that your book provides for you on this is in May in 2017. The citizens voted to expand the Medicaid Act that went off of the Affordable Care Act. This was your example of direct democracy. So remember, the republic, that's what happens at our national level. And the direct democracy, that is what happens at our local, state,